Muy buenas tardes y gracias por estar de regreso. Sigo yo con los anuncios logísticos. Para aquellas personas que están utilizando las piezas para la traducción, nos han informado que para poder mejorar la calidad de la traducción inglés-español, español-inglés, vamos a cambiar al canal 1 en sus aparatitos. La traducción de portugués sigue estando en el canal 5. Esperamos que de esta forma podamos solucionar los inconvenientes de traducción que hemos estado teniendo, y si alguno de sus aparatitos no funciona bien, por favor avísennos para poder cambiarlo. También quería pedirles si por favor nos pueden ayudar guardando sus identificaciones para usarlas durante los 3 días del evento, que esto nos permite identificarnos como participantes aquí en la sala y en otra serie de instancias logísticas que son necesarias. Veo que la sala sigue un poquito más vacía. Vamos a esperar, si no les molesta, un minutito más. Pero mientras tanto quisiera dar la bienvenida a Richard Ilife, no sé si lo pronuncié bien, que es el gerente de MRV en Gold Standard, quien es nuestro próximo panelista y nos va a hablar acerca de los requerimientos que tiene este fondo. Richard, please.
Hi, everyone. And you're feeling energized, looking forward to a technical session on rules and requirements. I will try and keep it light-hearted and keep it to the important information. So the topics I'm going to cover just now, so I'm going to just unpack some of the key gold standard requirements. So Caitlin's already talked about it. I will just go into them in a little bit more detail and talk about why really they mitigate risk and why they are good for investment in projects. I'm going to talk about the rationale behind the fund requirements. So the fund requirements, as I hope is clear now, is a fairly innovative thing for gold standard. And I'm going to talk about what led us to create them, you know, the drivers behind it, because I think that's quite revealing. Then I'm going to talk about the requirements themselves in detail. They operate at 2 levels, actually, so at fund, portfolio level, and investment level. I'm not going to talk too much about the fund level. It's more about investments, and it's really about what happens at the project level. And again, it relates to key gold standard requirements. Then I'll just wrap up with a summary. This slide, I think we've seen, and I don't really need to talk about much more. So essentially, gold standard, we have a large number of projects, and we've certainly seen a lot of impact over time. And we've used all of this experience in generating the fund requirements. Vision and mission, not super important thus now. So really the bit I want to talk about now is, what does gold standard certified actually mean? So as we've mentioned before, so gold standard work in 3 different areas. So environmental markets, i.e. carbon credits, impact and development finance, which is the main focus of SCF, and corporate climate and SDG reporting. What the takeaway bit here is that regardless whether you're a carbon offset project, whether you're a fund, or whether you're a scope 3 intervention, you will all have, if you're gold standard certified, certain key criteria about your investment project. And these are defined within our standard, which is called Gold Standard for the Global Goals. It can be a little bit confusing when we talk about standard being Gold Standard for the Global Goals, and also our name is Gold Standard. There's lots of use of the word standard. I will try and minimize it, but essentially what Gold Standard stands for are kind of 4 key areas. And the first 3 are, I'm sure, pretty much familiar to you all as things that are qualities of a robust and sustainable project. So the first one is stakeholder inclusivity. So gold standards have pretty robust requirements on stakeholder interactions. And we'll just summarize it really in 2 key points, is that all the relevant stakeholders to a project, so those people who may be affected or may have a relevant input to a project, they need to be consulted before a project starts. And not only that, that consultation and ongoing dialogue with project and stakeholders, vice versa, that needs to happen throughout the project cycle. So if it's a 15-year project, there needs to be some method or mechanism by which there is still a consultation possible. The second area is holistic impacts linked to sustainable development goals. So what we mean by holistic is that it's not just targeting one SDG. And in Gold Standard, the kind of priority SDG we have is SDG 13, which is climate change mitigation and or adaptation. It's not just that in Gold Standard. So you would need to make a contribution to climate change, but also a minimum of 2 other SDGs, such that the possibility of negative kind of focusing too heavily on one outcome, the potential for negative effects is reduced. The second bit is that all impacts within projects, within investments, are claimed against the business as usual baseline using robust methodologies. And so for Gold Standard, this is what we consider to mean impact. It needs to be doing something different, doing something impactful, and it needs to be done using a credible approach. The third key pillar of Gold Standard is our safeguards. So all Gold Standard investment projects have safeguards that again are put in place to avoid the possibility of unintended negative effects. So Gold Standard safeguards, they're built on other credible frameworks as well. But I think what makes us different is that in addition to complying with safeguards at the start of a project, you also have to comply with them throughout the project life cycle. So a little bit like stakeholder inclusivity, it's not just a design thing, it's an ongoing part of a project. So those are the kind of 3 key areas for Gold Standard and what we stand for. And the fourth bit that wraps it all together is that these 3 things are subject to an independent assessment. So auditors in Gold Standard system are independent of us. We don't kind of determine whether people comply with our rules or not, because that would present a little bit of a conflict of interest. It's someone who is independent from us who does that. We provide capacity building, and we check that they're doing a good job over time. So just want you to kind of bear those 3 key things in mind, and the fact that they are audited in Gold Standard. So as I mentioned, just going to talk about the background of the fund requirements, which are the framework that allow these 3 things to be certified in funds as opposed to just projects. So I think a key statement is that better, more holistic design reduces investment risk. And it's also good for financial performance. I think Gold Standards have earned this over time, in our experience. I think when we first started, it was fairly, let's say, less well understood. What I've certainly seen just from looking around in preparing for this is that actually other people are starting to come to the same conclusion. It's not just about the money. You need to look at other factors as well. So recent research from Gin and JP Morgan basically concluded that projects that prioritized impact, sustainable development impact, pretty much had the same financial returns as projects that were just pure financial return, which is quite an interesting finding. So in terms of the background, so this slide is kind of framing some of the regulatory things that we saw when we started developing these requirements, and they are in the EU. So one, which obviously doesn't seem immediately relevant, but we think because corporates are based around the world, it will spread across the world. So there is an interesting piece of legislation. So the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, is going to be requiring more robust reporting from companies. So corporate sustainability reporting historically has been ill-defined, let's say, and there hasn't really been any requirement for assurance. So this, I think people in the EU have noticed this, and the regulations are changing. So as of, I think, January 2024, corporate sustainability reports, if they're large companies already under a similar directive, they actually need to be audited before they are put in the public domain. And really, the reasoning behind this directive is part of a EU thinking to kind of make sure that investments are delivering on sustainability rather than just saying that they are. So again, another interesting thing related to financial products. So the Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation, that is also coming into play. So that regulates funds and sustainability funds and also kind of normal funds as well in terms of the claims that they make. So there is, pursuant to this legislation, so there's a few articles, Articles 6, 8 and 9. So 6 is just normal funds, 8 is what we would term light green, 9 is impactful funds. So these are going to be coming in under regulation. So 9, the kind of dark green impact fund is where SCF firmly sits. Another interesting movement on the landscape is other company reporting claims related to targets are also increasingly being regulated. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Sustainable Development Goals. There isn't necessarily a regulation behind that, but there is increasing expectations of companies to report credibly against the SDGs. Interestingly, so the Science-Based Targets Initiative, again, that is a kind of form of gentle regulation that is forcing companies to comply with publicly available standards, which means basically there is nowhere really to hide when you're making claims. Those claims need to be robust, and companies need to stand behind them. So all of this, all told, is that claims, reports, regulation, it's getting a bit more tight in the EU, and we think globally as well. So we've mentioned that gold standard is built on other frameworks. So I'm sure people in the room are familiar that there are actually a rather large number of sustainability frameworks. These don't necessarily have regulations, but they provide tools really for people to be able to assess their impacts. So things like operating principles for impact management, principles for responsible investment, IFC, these are all familiar frameworks for sustainability reporting and for funds. What I want to talk about on this slide, the thing that all of these have in common is that they are primarily process-based and they are really design-based, and it's kind of allied to reducing risk in projects. There is a lack of emphasis on performance reporting and also assurance, so i.e. audit. So we think there's a gap here, and because of the fact, as I mentioned previously on the other slide, we think there's a general movement towards greater scrutiny and greater expectation. We think performance reporting and assurance is going to be something, certainly if not today, in the future will be required of funds. So, as we've mentioned, Gold Standard have come to this relatively recently. We certainly haven't reinvented the wheel or pretended that we know anything kind of different to these guys, other than the fact that we have experience of performance reporting and assurance from our almost 20 years work in carbon markets. So we're really building on what other frameworks have, and we want to be able to harmonize. And I think there was a question earlier on today, who defines what sustainability is? There isn't really an answer at the moment, but we think if Gold Standard try and harmonize and take the best, that's a good path towards that answer. And the other takeaway point is that We think as investment decisions are increasingly going to be taken on a non-financial basis, again, related to the regulation, assurance is going to add value and we'll see demand. And this is what the fund requirements cater for. In addition to that, there's also the fact that there are a large amount of untapped opportunities. And I think Ronan touched on this point earlier. So if we think about SDG financing, there is a very large gap and a very small amount of money that goes to developing countries or to low-income countries. There's some statistics, 5% of international private capital flows go to such countries, which is pretty small. And in terms of the possibility of the impact that is available, if we frame it in terms of SDGs, up to 380 million jobs could be created and 12 trillion opportunities for business if we consider the end date of SDGs of 2030. All things told, it's an enormous opportunity for the private sector, but it's not tapped. What are the reasons for this? I would say in developing and emerging economies, there is, if not a high level of actual risk, it's certainly perceived risk, even though there is the opportunity of high returns. And if we consider that in a low growth scenario in developed countries, it still makes it even more unfathomable that money isn't going to these areas where there is the possibility for high impact and high returns. So it's clear there are barriers and we need to do something slightly different, and the fund requirements are gold standard's answer to this. So we think that by using some of the things that gold standard are known for, so stakeholder, safeguards, holistic impact approach, we can remove barriers and de-risk. And framing this all within gold standard fund certification, we think is part of that solution. And the final point that we were considering when developing these is the idea of scale. So gold standard historically has always been about project investments. And so you can see on the pyramid there, I'm sure people at the back probably can't read the writing, but the second layer there is really where projects, if you make an intervention in a project, the number of beneficiaries that you actually reach is much smaller versus than if you go further up the food chain or further upstream to the fund manager, to the people controlling where monies are invested in companies. And so we've really tried to bake that into our fund requirements and kind of provide a standardized way for fund managers to build in impact and sustainable development into the investment decisions so that ultimately more companies and more beneficiaries are positively impacted. So that's the background. Unfortunately, I'm now going to dig deep into some of the requirements themselves. As I mentioned, they operate at fund and investment level. So if we think about that, so fund level, that's really in the SNCF program. That's how Pegasus make their investment decisions. And then investment level, that's really about what investee companies need to do to comply with gold standard rules. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the fund level requirements. I will just touch on some of the high level points and spend most of my time talking about investment level, because that really can unpack some of the key bits about gold standard rules that we think will help de-risk and improve the opportunities for investments to attract money. So at fund level, essentially the fund manager, so in SNCF, Pegasus, it is beholden upon them to ensure that all investments and investees comply with gold standard rules via the processes that they, as a fund manager, follow. And this sounds complicated, but it's not actually super complicated. There are three key bits. And the first bit is regarding the fund's impact goals and their investment strategy. So in other words, how do they take investment decisions? So a couple of key points that do need to happen when defining impact goals, there needs to be a public statement, really positive with regard to positive impact. So the SNCF website, there's a screenshot on screen, and we talked about it before. So there are 4 key target impacts and framed within SDGs. So that's SDG 7, 8, 11, and 13. So there's some numbers. That's the aim of SCF. So that's kind of meeting the fund requirements in terms of defining goals. In terms of the investment strategy, this is the process for taking investment decisions. So investment decisions really can be summarized as the steps: go, no go, screening, feasibility, due diligence, and then eventually exit. So all of those steps need to be documented. Within SCF, the way that Pegasus take their investment decisions will eventually be documented, and it will be subject to audit, because that is one of the key aspects at fund level. Really, the gold standard certification aims to show that the processes at fund level are following good practice. So, as I mentioned, it needs to be documented. So there's a short screenshot of a template document that we require all funds to fill out. And so Pegasus and SCF will complete this design document soon. As you can imagine, it's an iterative process, working out your all the things that you do. But once these processes are defined, put into a template, audited and signed off, that marks the point at which investment decisions need to follow exactly what is documented. And so what a fund manager then needs to do is not only follow what they said they're going to do, but they also need to provide documentary evidence of this, again, with a view to allowing someone to be able to audit it. And so just to take an example, investment decisions, so go, no go, what would be expected in SCF is there would be effectively a documented evidence of those investments that passed, go, no go, and those that did not pass, because then you can very clearly, as an auditor, see whether a process has been followed or not. So the second 2 components at fund level, they're quite interrelated, governance and roles and responsibilities of staff. So governance, this is how the investment committee or board regulate the way that fund goes about achieving the impacts. So this is things like fund policies, any fund performance, incentives related to sustainable development, and above all, perhaps providing guidance on material sustainable development issues. So in the requirements, there are a couple of things regarding to competency about who sits on investment committees and boards, and similarly for roles and responsibilities of staff. The main point of this is that an auditor can have confidence that the fund is being governed and run in a way that prioritizes impact. And we consider that if this can be audited against publicly available requirements, it really gives confidence. So someone could see, perhaps before making an investment in a fund, it could be seen that a clear benchmark has been achieved, that the good processes are in place, and that the right teams are doing the right things and asking the right questions with regard to the impact objectives. So that's at the fund level. I'm going to talk more now about, I think that's skipped on a little bit, about investment level. So at the bottom of the screen is a short summary of the project cycle, investment project cycle. I'm not confident that that's going to be shown so well. I don't think it's essential to understand this. So let's talk about investment level, go, no go, and kind of early stage screening. So this is about whether projects are fundamentally eligible. And so Jao mentioned that category A projects are not eligible in SCF. That is a GCF eligibility requirement. Gold standard also have some eligibility requirements as well. And again, it's related to sustainable development risk. Essentially, if there are projects with high level risk, then they're not going to be eligible. Gold standard actually have very few. The main exclusions we have are energy shouldn't come from fossil fuels, nuclear energy is also not allowed, and geoengineering without obvious sustainable development impacts. For example, solar radiation management, putting reflective materials in space, that type of thing is not eligible. That and RED plus, which is a kind of avoided deforestation approach. That's pretty much it for gold standard eligibility. And the reason for that is gold standards tend to have rules that mitigate risks in project design. So it's a really, gold standard can be thought of as a kind of management system to kind of remove risk from projects that people want to achieve. There are a couple of minor eligibility concerns that I'll just draw attention to. I'm sure these are not going to come to as a surprise to anyone. So GMOs, genetically modified organisms, cannot be introduced as part of an impact investment. Things like DDT, PCBs that are subject to international bans cannot be part of investments. This is all fairly straightforward stuff. And hydropower projects cannot be in areas of high conservation value. So, these are not onerous requirements, and I'm pretty sure most of the global community would get behind these. So how does this work at an investment level process? So essentially, a fund manager, Pegasus, would address exclusion criteria by asking investees a series of short screening questions. For instance, do your hydro project, please confirm if it is in an area of high conservation value or not. So that's the way that these criteria would be teased out at a fairly early stage. There is a project submission form. We've seen that on screen before, and the eligibility criteria from SCF, as well as gold standard. Within that project submission form, there is likely to be enough information to decide fundamentally whether an opportunity is go or no go. And if it's go, that doesn't necessarily mean that the project is going to receive investment. It just means, in principle, it is not ineligible. So that's how the gold standard eligibility is weaved in at investment level. So safeguards, how do they work at an investment level? As we've mentioned previously, gold standard safeguards, we've built them on other credible frameworks. So IFC, so a couple of UN frameworks are also the building blocks really of it. We have additional gold standard criteria on a few of them. But again, the key differentiation between us and other standards is that ongoing monitoring, if there is a risk, is required. So gold standard have 25 safeguards in total. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through that whole list. I'm going to talk about how they're positioned in gold standard, because really what our standard tries to do is not force too much process, too much documentation if it's not necessary. So that's why our safeguards, 20 of them, of these 25, are context specific. So in other words, there is an assessment process that determines if a safeguard is indeed applicable. But as I mentioned, 5 safeguards are applicable to all projects. So the gold standard mandatory safeguards tend to be things that are cross-cutting. So I'll just talk about them briefly. So human rights, gender, community health, safety and working conditions, corruption and labour rights. And so I think you can see within these safeguards, if you can make sure safeguards are addressed in these areas, it's generally going to mean that project has a greater potential to not fall into a trap of unintentional negative impact. So in terms of how safeguards are assessed at investment level, the next slide, I'm just going to talk through an example of how a context-specific assessment might be done. So this would be something that a fund manager would screen investees for. And I will talk about an example. It's clear to me now that no one is going to be able to read this writing, so I'll just summarize it super briefly. So I'm going to take the example of sites of cultural and historical heritage. So clearly that is not applicable to every single project type. If your project is not in an area where there are cultural and historical heritage, the safeguard doesn't apply. And so what the assessment aims to do is take an investee through that process in a transparent and auditable fashion. The example I chose, it's a strange example really, but it's a PV project in which there is a large and significant banyan tree that's highly valued by the local community for religious reasons. So it's on the southern boundary of the proposed project site where these panels are going to be installed. And so what a project then needs to do is essentially mitigate that risk. It's not requiring that the project needs to not do anything near the proposed area. Rather, it should mitigate the risk. And so the way that this example talks about that is by saying, yes, this project design, there will be no panels that are installed within an area around that tree, and the access road that we need to install those panels is going to be constructed to the north of the project area, thus protecting that southern boundary where the tree is located. And then what is also an important part of safeguards, if there is a risk that continually needs to be monitored in a project, that risk and monitoring approach needs to be added to the investment monitoring plan and needs to be audited every year. This particular example, I would say, does not require annual monitoring, because if you install the panels in year 0 of the project and you're not going to install anything more, the idea that panels would be installed next to that tree is not particularly risky. But in this example, I've illustrated that perhaps how a project might display that they have a real good handle on this risk is that the exclusion zone is marked on some maps. Perhaps there is GPS coordinates attached with a view that an auditor can go on site and check that it does indeed, the project mitigates the risk in the way that it says it has done. So fund manager, it's their job to make sure that this assessment needs to happen. As an investee, the role of an investee is just to provide the information. So fund managers really will screen for these risks, and that will happen in screening due diligence phase, depending on the level of complexity. An important point to mention within the SCF program is that the technical assistance facility, it does exist to be able to build capacity really in projects. So imagine if a potential investee doesn't have the necessary abilities to collect data of the required quality. So technical assistance within the SCF program can help bridge that gap. So, but again, it's for projects that really are on their way to becoming investment ready, and there's a small kind of adjustment that can be resolved with technical assistance. So that's how safeguards are addressed at investment level. I'm just going to wait for the slide to move. Okay. Next bit is the gold standard stakeholder consultation. Just as I mentioned, this needs to happen before a decision has been made on committing to significant project investment. And really the purpose behind that is, if you have a stakeholder consultation with people who are going to be affected by the project, and you've already signed off on the EPC, you've procured everything in that project, the chances that you will change that project after a consultation with your stakeholders is pretty low. And so that's the reason that gold standard consultations happen before those types of things are committed to. And really that balances the need with need for investment to move, but also to take stakeholder feedback when it can potentially have a material influence on the design of a project. So consultation is pretty straightforward. There is a template report that is available. It consists of 4 key areas. So in essence, the information made to stakeholders needs to be transparently described and recorded. So that's with a view to making sure that stakeholders really actually understand what the project is about, and they haven't merely been told a sort of greenwashed version of the project. And the invitation process and who is invited, that is also regulated by gold standard rules. So there's a number of key groups who need to be invited. They're people who you might expect to be useful stakeholders. So local people who are affected, local landowners, policymakers, local NGOs, and we also have a gold standard NGO supporter community that we require to be engaged, certainly in the invitation process, just so that they can comment on a project if they would like to. And invites need to be done in a timely fashion, again, to counter the possibility that invites are sent 2 days before the event by someone who wanted to do a consultation in name only. The third part is continuous input and grievance mechanism. So this is what I mentioned earlier. So this is the way that stakeholders can continually engage with the project throughout the project life. The grievance and input mechanism needs to be mutually agreed with the stakeholders at the consultation. For instance, if the way that people best access information is via WhatsApp, that's totally fine as a grievance mechanism. If in rural locations, perhaps there is a logbook based in the village development office, and that is the preferred way to engage, that is also okay. It just needs to be agreed with stakeholders. The fourth bit is the feedback round. As I mentioned earlier, there's 2 rounds in gold standard consultation. The second round is really to reflect on the first consultation with stakeholders, to take on board their feedback, and inform those stakeholders how their views have been incorporated into the project design. To be absolutely clear, there is no requirement that project design needs to be changed on the basis of what stakeholders say. We have seen some stakeholder reports where people say, well, we didn't want a green turbine, we wanted a purple one. It's really not for those kind of immaterial comments to be considered. Really, it's so that material issues, in the interests of both parties, really can be transparently documented, assessed, and designs the change in design main if needed. As I mentioned, there's a template report. The person who will require the consultation to happen is the fund manager. So typically what we expect is that fund managers will engage local NGOs to conduct this stakeholder consultation. As I mentioned, the requirements are straightforward. They're laid out in a template format. Really importantly, from an investee perspective, if you have a project idea, you're not forced to attend or be present on any of these consultations. That part is handled. But obviously, if there is an outcome from a consultation that affects the design of an investment or a project, the expectation that there, certainly it would be considered in that design. Okay, impacts. So how are these assessed? As I mentioned, the gold standard requirements are impacts are claimed against business as usual using robust methodologies. Really, we have 2 main approaches, and these are split by the type of SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, they are. In summary, SDG 13, so climate, related to the fact that historically gold standard has been extremely active in offset markets. SDG 13, we have a lot of methodologies that serve this particular SDG. So we have 189 methodologies that can be used to report impacts from various project types, spanning dairy feed supplements that reduce methane emissions from cows, to safe water supply projects that displace boiling, by people in the business as usual scenario. So it's those SDG methodologies. They tend to be complex, certainly in how they appear. And this relates to the fact that much of Gold Standard's early work was related to clean development mechanism, and I think clean development mechanism tends to frame documents in a slightly confusing manner. Gold Standard, we've certainly done our part to try and make it a little bit more straightforward to understand. I would say certainly for energy projects, fundamentally methodologies are something that anyone can get their head around. It's things like land use projects that tend to be a little bit more complicated. But again, we recognize this complexity and are working on solutions. So say, for instance, increased digitization of monitoring, reporting and verification. So that's talking about SDG 13. So for the other SDGs, so SDG 1 to 17, there is a Gold Standard SDG tool. So there is a screenshot just shown, and really for each SDG, there is a number of different possible methods that can be used from this Gold Standard SDG tool to enable you to report on your impacts. So I think on the screen is, if I can't read it, I'm not sure anyone else can. On screen is SDG 15, so life on land. So it's I can't actually see what it says, so I'm not going to talk too much about that one. But suffice it to say, the Gold Standard SDG tool, what you can see on those rows is effectively a categorization system of what are the indicators that need to be monitored. So one of the weaknesses we found with other reporting frameworks is essentially what you have is a set of KPIs. And that really is what the SDGs are. But what the SDG tool does is it unpacks these KPIs. So if the KPI is improved indoor air quality percent, that is an SDG indicator. The Gold Standard SDG tool approach would be to basically bring that down into a set of instructions that you would know what data to collect in your project to be able to show how you perform against the KPI, which is that SDG. So as I mentioned, the other SDGs are pretty straightforward, and what the SDG tool does is, yes, it unpacks it in a transparent way, and it also it's publicly available as well, so people can see how you as a fund manager and as an investee are recording impact in your project. So what is important to know as well is whether it is an SDG 13 methodology, whether it is an SDG tool. Gold Standard certainly don't have a methodology or impact approach for absolutely everything under the sun, but we welcome the opportunity to create a solution if that's what's needed. And certainly within SCF, there is funding as part of capacity building to basically create Gold Standard methodologies, tools and solutions that enable impact to be quantified in projects in a straightforward manner. Suffice it to say that there is a fairly robust review and approval process. So whether it is an SDG tool or a methodology, essentially that approach needs to go through a technical advisory committee. So Gold Standard, we effectively don't decide on our own rules. We recommend rules based on our experience to an independent technical advisory committee who will either tell us yes or no, your Gold Standard recommendation is acceptable in line with your own sort of mission, really, which is reporting measurable sustainable development impact. So that's how SDG impact works at Gold Standard. So as I mentioned, what I've been talking about here is at the investment, at the project level. So there needs to be a flow of information from the investment level to the fund, and the entity who is in charge of that, as you would expect, is the fund manager. So really what, as an investee, you would expect to happen from a fund manager in SCF is there would be instructions on how to collect SDG impact data, monitoring data. Let's say that there are some safeguards that need to be monitored in a particular project. There will be a set of instructions defined by the fund manager in line with Gold Standard rules, and those instructions need to be followed by investees. I would say in general the level of extra reporting information is, I would hope, low extra effort for investees. I have made the example of land use projects as being slightly different there, because until we manage to digitize absolutely everything, for instance, in a forestry project, it's still going to involve sending people out to the field to go and measure trees and count the number of trees in areas. So yeah, essentially, as an investee, the predefined set of instructions for collecting data will be provided by a fund manager in SCF, and that really is how it works. So getting that information that is collected by investees back to the fund level in terms of reporting, again, this is something that is managed by the fund manager. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a documented set of processes that need to be followed. And so the fund manager, so Pegasus, in this example, need to follow all of those processes that eventually will be approved by a Gold Standard auditor. And really what the idea of those processes would be to ensure that the data quality from investees is of an acceptable level. You know, so we're all human beings. So investees potentially could report information that's missing, or there is some evidence. So let's say invoice for quantities purchased. If those reporting evidences are not supplied, really the job of the fund manager is to spot that via the processes that they put in place. Essentially the quality management system that they're running to get information from investees up to the fund level, with a view to reporting the impacts of the fund. And so, as you can see, SCF, we've got the numbers on screen against the 4 SDGs. What we're hoping in probably a couple of years from now, the first impact report will be collated by Pegasus, and an auditor will check that report, and they will also check that all of the processes that have been documented have indeed been followed, and then eventually in effect the reported numbers against SDGs claimed would then be certified as correct, as having happened. And really that is a differentiation against other funds who wouldn't tend to talk in those terms, or if they did talk in those terms, they certainly wouldn't be able to make such an unequivocal statement as these impacts have actually happened and someone else has gone out to go and check it. And as I mentioned early on in this presentation, we really do think that this is the direction of travel in the world of sustainability and impact. So we think it's where it's going to end up. So final slide is just a diagram that kind of shows that flow of information, really. So and it talks about the processes, that funnel on the left-hand side. If you can think of the initial pipeline getting narrower and narrower, kind of trimming down from investment opportunities, go, no go, due diligence screening, eventually to you get to the projects that are considered to be compliant with the fund's requirements. They then enter the portfolio, and then they become part of the impact reporting system. And then at the end, the certified SDG impacts are what will come out. So I think that's it. So really, take-home messages. You know, I'm conscious that there's a lot of information that I've talked about here. I think if you go away with the kind of idea that investment decisions, they are increasingly being made with impacts, sustainability claims in mind. And we've developed our fund requirements based on this knowledge. And we've really tried to build on the work of others who've put together some really good process-based sustainability requirements, but we've tried to fill the gap that we think, that we know does exist, and we gap that we think is going to be an expectation in future. As I say, bearing in mind that investment decisions are increasingly going to be thinking about things other than just money. And so the fund requirements really are focusing on performance reporting and assurance. And so the key bits from the gold standard perspective are that stakeholders are actively engaged in investments, in projects. There is a holistic and robust SDG impact following credible approaches and not just focusing on one SDG, and the safeguards. The unintended negative impacts are managed. And all of these key gold standard requirements are kind of baked into the management processes of the fund, and therefore the investments that are made by that fund. And so really, to sum it all up, we hope that the fund requirements will be an effective de-risking tool. We're pretty sure it's a credible impact reporting tool, and all of which is designed with the idea of increasing investor confidence, and therefore, and also increasing the chances of projects being sustainable and impactful over the long term. And that's it. So I will pause there and see if there's any questions.
Sí, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I have two specific questions. One is regarding the claim mechanism, no? We are talking of the grievance mechanism, no? I mean, for the GCF, all the program must have a grievance mechanism to ensure transparencies, et cetera, So it's one thing, I mean, at the SCF program level.
Yep.
And then we have for a specific project, then the question is, when, I mean, I imagine that the grievance mechanism should be in place once the project is approved. No? It's
Yes,
being
yeah.
implemented, so it's just to confirm.
Can be before, but yeah.
Okay. And the other question, I forgot. No, I forgot. It was a grievance mechanism. I had another one, but okay, let's move to another question.
I'll just talk quickly about the two grievance mechanisms. Yeah, as you rightly said, the GCF grievance mechanism, that's one thing. What they do is totally different to the gold standard grievance mechanism. I'm pretty sure the GCF grievance mechanism, I imagine it's pretty much the same. It's, you know, there is a channel for people to report if they have a concern. I don't really know too much about it, but I imagine they're similar. Correct. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a web portal. As I was mentioning, it needs to be in a format that's most useful for the people affected by the project. So yeah.
Sorry, the other question was about the
No, sí sale un poquito. Well, good afternoon. I have a question. Well, it is a concern because here we are not known for having enough data, and the baselines are a requirement for you. And also the robust methodology, I know that it requires many data, so maybe it would be difficult to use this methodology here in our context.
Yep, fair points. In terms of robust baseline, the idea of a gold standard methodology is to describe how you might define a baseline with the available data. I think for most project types, there is generally some type of baseline data, as long as it's a credible source. You know, so it could be, for instance, UN, FAO. Those are all kind of highly credible, you know, multinational studies. They're acceptable to be used in gold standard. If a reputable entity has done actual primary data collection, that is also okay, and it can be somewhere between that, between primary data collection and kind of global average data on baselines. So I do think it's possible to get credible baseline data wherever you are in the world. In terms of complexity and collecting much data, I do share your concern. Yeah, so some methodologies can be a little bit complex, certainly when you look at them. But we are working on making them much more straightforward. And I think the piece of work that Gold Standard needs to focus on is perhaps finding that middle ground between carbon offset projects, which is historically what we've always worked towards. And in carbon offset projects, you count every single bean. You know, the level of data complexity and integrity is extremely, it's almost fanatical. And you know, in many places, you can actually simplify that with conservative assumptions, and Gold Standard are certainly open to that, and we have been doing that in SCF. So we've been working with Pegasus. So, for instance, in PV panel projects, there is an approved carbon credit methodology. I would say the data collection is not overly onerous, but we basically agreed with Pegasus that there is actually a credible substitute for more data points. So rather than collecting 3, you could just collect 1. You know, so kind of 3 data points each year for the lifetime of the project versus you collect 1 data point. So we're absolutely, you know, kind of hear that concern about complexity and data, but we're, you know, absolutely open to making things much more simple. So.
Bueno, mi nombre es Patricio Vallespín, soy gobernador de la región de los Lagos y presidente de la Asociación de Gobernadores Regionales de Chile, de las 16 regiones. A nosotros nos pareció importante participar en este evento porque hablaba de nivel subnacional de financiamiento climático. La pregunta que quiero hacer es, ¿de qué manera, en qué momento y cómo las autoridades regionales nos podemos involucrar en este tipo de iniciativas? Porque estos proyectos se desarrollan en un territorio, una comuna, una región, que tiene una estrategia regional de desarrollo, que tiene impulsos regionales de las cosas que quiere impulsar, tiene impulsos nacionales también que afectan ese territorio, y que el ideal en algún minuto es que parte de esto pudiera ser parte de una política pública en el territorio. Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿cómo involucrarnos nosotros como máxima autoridad regional, que tenemos fondos, tenemos recursos? En mi región yo tengo una alerta climática ambiental, tengo un pacto para una región sostenible e inclusiva, donde los actores privados se comprometen a hacer iniciativas sostenibles, y no lo veo muy claramente en este esquema de trabajo. Me gustaría saber cómo pudiéramos involucrarnos.
Okay. not going to. Yeah, I mean, I think I understood, but I'm not going to be able to say in Spanish. ¿Habla usted inglés? Oh, he's got a thing. Right. Okay. What was your question? Just so I understand well, how and at what point can you be involved in these initiatives? Yeah. Yeah. I would say I'm not the best person to answer that. From the perspective of SCF. So I would perhaps defer to my colleagues in R20 and Pegasus. So I know that R20 are involved in working with NDAs and subnational authorities. So I think they're the best people to talk to. So I'm not sure if Zhao is in the room, Zhao Tang, but I think she would be a good person to talk to. So Gold Standard, we don't necessarily get involved in engagement activities as much as the other partners. So I'm sorry I couldn't. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Laura Salgado, I work for South Pole, Carbon Asset Manager. And of course, my question is about carbon performance in this type of project. So is it actually a plus, like for instance, if the projects that are presented to the SCF have some sort of standard that is related to carbon credits, for instance, the standard that Gold Standard has, or Vera, or other similar. Is that a plus? How can that interact with these eligibility standards that you create for the initiative?
Okay. Carbon offset projects are a separate kind of certification type other than the fund requirements that I've been talking about. That said, subnational climate fund can actually have a percentage of up to 20% carbon credit projects. So it is possible to be a carbon credit project and be involved in SCF. There are a couple of things related to claims about the fund that SNCF, and it's mainly at GCF level actually, that any impacts that come from carbon credits cannot be claimed by the fund as a whole, because I'm sure you can see if you're a carbon credit project, you've effectively sold the rights to emission reductions and other sustainability claims to the owner. Yeah. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. My name is Mario once again. I'm from Costa Rica, and I work in conservation, and I work on forest and the green thing, okay? You mentioned before, let's see if I catch you correctly, that you said that RED Plus programs are out of Gold Standard and therefore are out of Pegasus, which is just by linking. You are in tropical Latin America, I mean, where trees and our ecosystems are basically, it's part of our lives. And in urban cities like Quito, is far away from Amazonia. In countries like Costa Rica, the park is literally the other side of the river that bound the city, so to speak. But the question is why? Why RED Plus programs are out of this loop, if you will? Thank you.
No problem. So speaking for Gold Standard, so we have afforestation and reforestation projects, so those we allow. So that's fine. We also allow improved forestry management activities. That's okay with Gold Standard. Coming to RED and RED Plus, the reason that Gold Standard have taken a decision not to certify these projects under Gold Standard is because essentially there are some issues regarding the baseline in these projects. Effectively, what the project is saying, for the purposes of receiving revenue, is saying, well, this area is not going to be cut down because of our activities, and that is a very hypothetical situation, and there are also some technicalities related to, well, how much carbon would be sequestered in that project anyway. So it's purely from an environmental integrity point of view that the gold standard don't allow red, but we're open to other credible approaches regarding conservation. It's just not red plus. Just the way it works is, yeah, just needs a bit of adjustment in our view.
Thank you. Quick question, well, two-part question. One, I was checking the website regarding the methodology. You were commenting about the investment, different things that are necessary. And again, going back to what I said previously, in order to facilitate the development of a project before coming forward for Pegasus and other parties involved, is there a template so that can people prepare the information that gold standards needs to evaluate? I didn't find it specifically for the fund. Maybe later if you can give us a website so we can look at. And the other one, the most important one, is regarding the costs. Recently, last year, I saw that a local bank had an oversubscription of an international bond, and when that supposedly was directly only for ESG investing in the country. When I asked the president of the bank why isn't the cost lower, considering that your financing was lower than normal sources, he said because of all the reporting involved. Going back to what I see here and all the structure involved, what is it that is needed from the local authorities, from the reporting, or maybe have aids from the multilateral parts to develop the data component that our previous person said that the data is lacking? What is it that you think would be able to reduce the cost of that following up? Because that, I think that's some of the things that make this, from a financial point of view, more costly than other measures of financing. I don't know if I...
Yeah, okay. So in terms of a template for gold standard methodologies, I hear you. I think it would be a good idea to at least have people understand what types of activities do have a methodology and approximately what types of data do need to be collected. So for example, a PV project, data that needs to be collected. So, essentially meter readings, needs to be a grid emission factor, needs to be, load and transmission and distribution losses. So that's a relatively straightforward example. And I think in that case, it would help people, when they're at a fairly early stage, they can see what's involved and it's not actually that overwhelming. So I think that would be good. In terms of cost of collecting data, yes, there is always a cost to collecting data. And I mean, as I mentioned before, gold standard, what we try and do is make sure that the cost of data collection is as low as is possible. We try to be practical in terms of the data that's collected versus the realistic nature of the claim. So if you want something to be real, if you want emission reductions to be real, there is always going to be a data collection cost. So we can't really avoid that, but what we can do is try and minimize where possible. So some of the things that we have worked on thus far is using publicly available data as benchmarks. So that type of thing could work. Certainly for baselines, but I think when you come to monitoring projects, I'm not really sure of any other solution other than going out and collecting data. So certain types of projects lend themselves well to digitization, and gold standard is working on coupling impact reporting with digital connection to project monitoring. So I hear you. We're working on the solution, but there is no magic bullet.
Hi, Kelly Witkowski from the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. I know that the Subnational Climate Fund is also interested in the resilience, the climate resilience benefits, but when I looked at what you presented for SDG 13, it primarily only referred to the mitigation benefits. I just wanted to understand where you're suggesting that those additional climate resilience benefits be captured, if it's in the other SDGs, or if there's also a way to capture that under SDG 13.
Yep, it's a timely question. So tomorrow you'll have the pleasure of me presenting on this subject. So gold standards, we define our mission statement in terms of climate security, which has always been mitigation and adaptation. Yes, we've done more work on the mitigation thing. Adaptation, if I remember well, SDG 13, there are some indicators under there for mitigation. Those can be used under a project today. It's just that they're not currently captured in our SDG tool. So that kind of approval process that I mentioned would be needed to put them in there. I don't think there'd be any problem with that whatsoever. So that's kind of a more simple way of doing it. In terms of a more kind of fundamental approach to designing a project for resilience and climate adaptation. We're working on a new standard called the adaptation requirements, and that's the thing I'll be talking about tomorrow. So, yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Gabriela Arellano, and I'm working currently for Lions. For Lions is based in Germany, but I'm here doing home office in charge of projects in Colombia, Peru, and Guatemala. So I have two questions. One, R20 mentioned in his presentation that 47 projects passed the eligibility part, and 9 projects are in the feasibility study part. I understood that. And the first question is, at this stage, do you have, as gold standard, do you have any lessons learned or bottlenecks or challenge that you can mention to us to implement the methodology? And the second question is, do you have plan to have a capacity building or a special support during the implementation of the project with the project developers in order to implement this methodology?
Thank you. Yes, a good question. So things that we've learned thus far, I think the key thing is application of methodologies and simply working out if there is a methodology that is suitable for your project. But believe it or not, that is actually not as straightforward as it sounds. So for those 189 methodologies that I mentioned, they're all extremely project specific in general. And so because of that specificity, it means that there are a number of applicability criteria that need to be complied with. When an investment comes along, there isn't actually a really straightforward way of appraising the whole list of methodologies to say, hey, you're a wind power project. You should look at these 3 methodologies. Of those 3, what one is likely to be okay for your project. So that is something that we've taken away as a learning, and is something that I certainly think with SCF funding we're going to implement, because it's something that we've certainly Pegasus have told us is a challenge. In terms of capacity building workshops, yes, there's budget under the SCF program. We haven't actually planned any events, but certainly it's in the back of my mind that capacity building is needed, because it can be a complex subject. I think it seems more complex than what it appears, and so something like a capacity building workshop on that theme, I think could really break down some barriers. So yeah, thank you.
So we are going to the, Richard, you're really taller than me. So we are going to the questions for the online, from the online audience. No, that's okay, because Richard will have to answer. So the first one is if you can go a little bit further on green taxonomy and how does the gold standard fits into these new taxonomies for green finance.
Is this the EU taxonomy or?
We're here in Latin America. There's been like a process of understanding what is sustainable and what is not. Okay. So they're identifying indicators and methodologies and process, and different entities have different taxonomies or standards for defining what is sustainable or not. So do we need a regional taxonomy? How can an institution identify which standard to adhere to and sort of like that?
No, I mean, I think that would be a question. Certainly in gold standard, one thing we do envisage is trying to align with other standards to kind of cut through the complexity. This particular example I hadn't heard about, so that's more work for us. In terms of how is it decided that a project is sustainable or not? Really, that's what I've tried to convey on the screen, really. So it's a project that has a good stakeholder consultation, has effective safeguards in place that are specific to the project type and eligibility. And certainly in SCF, the kind of projects with the most risk are automatically screened out, as Jao mentioned earlier. But thank you for the question. It's certainly something we can consider for alignment.
Thank you. So I'm going to the next question, and it is, are gold standard methodologies open access?
Yes. It's, yeah, I did mention that on the screen. It's a really important point, and sorry if I didn't convey it clearly. So all gold standard methodologies, all of gold standard rules, they're a public good. No one owns them. You don't need to pay to use them. Yeah, you need to pay to be certified. That's a nuance, but anyone can look at a standard and use it as it's a public good.
So maybe can you give us like a web page or something so people can look at it?
Yes, sure. Now?
I don't know if you can spell it, but we can write it down and give it to you.
We can send it to the...
Yeah, we can send it to them later, yes. And the last question is, sorry, my screen got locked. Okay. It goes, I'm going to read it. Okay. So, although many subnational governments in Latin America and the Caribbean might have some kind of autonomy, the kind of project that the Subnational Climate Fund is looking for needs a blended finance model that is normally out from the regional or local government's sphere. Is it better to involve national entities in this financial model? For example, waste, sanitation, and energy projects might require some kind of national subsidies, I'm sorry, my English, to be profitable. If these are located in regions, municipalities where local population are smaller and have lower incomes.
Not really sure how to respond to that. Do you think I could read it? Would that be okay?
Yeah, okay.
Just it sort of there's a lot to take in. Thank you. National entities in the financial model. I'm sorry to say, anything to do with financial modelling, you would have to involve Pegasus, and I'm afraid Ronan has disappeared. Yeah, I mean, certainly anything that works and that makes sense, yeah, Pegasus would be open to, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sorry I can't provide a better answer to that.
So thank you. Are there any more questions? So, well, we have 5 more minutes till coffee break. So I don't know if you want to say hello to the person next to you or someone you haven't said hello to, so we can start like profiting from this, from being in person in this meeting. And I'll ask you to kindly join us for coffee break in 5 to 10 more minutes. And we'll come back at 16:30, 4:30 de la tarde. Thank you.